They erased her from the guest list. Then her husband pulled up in a Rolls-Royce. The rain patters against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Metropolitan Museum's exclusive gala hall as New York's elite gather for the charity auction that defines social hierarchy in a city where wealth whispers and power speaks through gilded invitations that determine who belongs in spaces that money can access but acceptance must approve. At the registration desk, event coordinator Miranda Thornton discovers that Dr. Keisha Williams, renowned cardiac surgeon whose innovations have saved thousands of lives, has been mysteriously removed from the guest list, her name vanishing from records despite her foundation's $50,000 sponsorship of tonight's fundraiser for children's medical research. Outside in the storm, a midnight blue Rolls-Royce Phantom glides through Manhattan traffic, its passenger unaware that his wife faces humiliation designed to teach her that professional excellence cannot overcome social barriers that old money maintains through casual cruelties disguised as administrative errors. That achievement means nothing when acceptance requires approval from people whose worth they measure through bloodlines rather than brilliance, through connections rather than contributions to humanity that healing hands provide when love saves lives that prejudice would rather see perish than acknowledge the doctors who defy their assumptions about who deserves recognition. The Metropolitan Museum's annual Heart Foundation Gala represents more than fundraising. It serves as social laboratory where New York's established elite conduct experiments in exclusion, testing boundaries of acceptance while maintaining plausible deniability about discrimination that legal challenges might address, but that cultural practices perpetuate through methods refined over generations of keeping power concentrated among familiar families whose wealth accumulated through historical advantages that current systems protect, while appearing merit-based to observers who don't recognize how privilege reproduces itself through networks that opportunity creates for insiders, while creating barriers for everyone else regardless of qualifications that objective evaluation would recognize, but that subjective assessment often dismisses when bias influences judgment. Miranda Thornton embodies institutional gatekeeping that preserves hierarchies through administrative authority that appears neutral, while serving prejudices that policy might prohibit, but that practice often enables when individual decisions aggregate into systematic exclusion that affects entire communities through patterns that analysis would reveal, but that comfort prefers ignoring when recognition would demand. Changes that threaten established arrangements benefiting those whose position depends on maintaining systems that serve some while disadvantaging others through methods that democracy should eliminate, but that tradition often protects when accountability threatens convenience that privilege provides through distance from consequences that other people experience. Dr. Keisha Williams represents everything that traditional social hierarchies fear: brilliance that cannot be dismissed, achievement that demands recognition, competence that threatens assumptions about who deserves success when merit challenges inherited advantage, when excellence emerges from backgrounds that prejudice assumes cannot produce capability, when innovation comes from minds that education supposedly couldn't develop despite evidence that talent exists everywhere but gets acknowledged only when crisis forces recognition, that comfort zones typically prevent through informal barriers that formal policies might prohibit, but that cultural practices maintain through methods that scrutiny would expose, but that silence protects. Her medical achievements read like script for inspiring film. First Black woman to lead cardiac surgery at Manhattan Presbyterian Hospital, developer of techniques that reduce transplant rejection rates by 40%. Researcher whose innovations have made life-saving procedures accessible to patients that previous methods couldn't help when complexity required simplification that only breakthrough thinking could provide through dedication, that obstacles strengthen rather than discourage when purpose transcends personal advancement to serve healing, that humanity requires regardless of social position or cultural background, when lives hang in balance that prejudice would tip toward tragedy, but that skill must save through competence that training develops, but that character must guide. The foundation she established with her husband channels millions toward pediatric cardiac research, while providing scholarships for medical students from underserved communities. Their philanthropy creating opportunities that systematic barriers typically prevent when access requires resources that circumstances might not provide, but that potential deserves regardless of packaging that might suggest inadequacy rather than hidden strength when capability waits for recognition that justice demands, but that comfort often refuses when change threatens arrangements that benefit some while disadvantaging others through patterns that analysis would reveal, but that tradition prefers maintaining when accountability requires effort that convenience discourages through distance that privilege provides from consequences that engagement would force acknowledgement. Tonight's administrative error represents culmination of months of subtle signals that Dr. Williams's presence creates discomfort among board members whose donations by influence that money should never provide in organizations dedicated to serving humanity rather than serving donor preferences when healing requires focusing on patients rather than politics, medicine rather than money, lives rather than social position, when effectiveness demands prioritizing competence over connections, results over relationships, excellence over exclusion, when purpose transcends prejudice to serve values that mission statements claim, but that practice often contradicts when culture overcomes policy through informal education that shapes behavior more powerfully than formal training, when comfort zones protect prejudices that accountability should eliminate. The guest list revision happens through email chain that reads like masterclass in institutional discrimination. Seemingly reasonable concerns about event capacity and venue limitations, masking systematic attempt to reduce DR. Williams's visibility at gathering, where her presence would challenge comfortable assumptions about who belongs in spaces that wealth can access, but that acceptance must approve when social hierarchies require maintenance through methods that legal scrutiny might expose, but that cultural practices disguise as administrative necessity rather than prejudicial preference that evidence would reveal if investigation replaced. Comfortable ignorance with uncomfortable truth about systematic exclusion. Board Chairman Reginald Pemberton III orchestrates removal through language carefully calibrated to avoid legal liability while achieving desired result. Dr. Williams's absence from event where her foundation's contributions should guarantee recognition, but where her presence creates cognitive dissonance among donors whose philanthropy depends on maintaining distance from communities they claim to serve, when charity becomes performance rather than genuine commitment to justice that systematic change would require, but that comfortable gestures can substitute for when intention matters less than impact. That measurement would reveal if accountability replaced sentiment as standard for evaluating effectiveness of efforts that resources could make transformative. The conspiracy involves multiple levels of museum hierarchy, each participant contributing plausible deniability while enabling discrimination that individual actions might not constitute, but that collective behavior clearly represents when patterns emerge that analysis would expose, but that comfortable assumptions prefer ignoring when recognition would demand responses that threaten established arrangements benefiting those whose position depends on maintaining systems that systematic reform would challenge through transparency that corruption fears, but that justice demands when institutions serve public rather than protecting private interests that influence should never purchase in organizations dedicated to serving humanity rather than donor preferences. Miranda executes removal with bureaucratic efficiency that transforms discrimination into administrative procedure, her actions protected by institutional authority that appears neutral while serving prejudices that training might address, but that culture often reinforces when informal education shapes behavior more powerfully than formal policy, when comfort zones enable practices that scrutiny would eliminate, but that silence protects through networks that defend misconduct while punishing. Accountability that democracy demands from public institutions whose legitimacy depends on serving everyone rather than just those whose preferences align with administrative biases that transparency should expose, but that tradition often conceals. The timing of removal, hours before event when alternatives become impossible. demonstrates strategic thinking that transforms accidental oversight into deliberate sabotage that plausible deniability might protect, but that pattern analysis would reveal as systematic rather than coincidental when behavior consistently disadvantages same populations through methods that appear random, but that investigation would expose as coordinated when accountability demands transparency. That comfort zones resist through institutional loyalty that serves corruption rather than justice when organizations choose protecting image over serving mission that public trust requires, but that private interests often corrupt. Dr. Williams discovers exclusion through email that arrives while she prepares for evening that should celebrate her foundation's contributions, but that administrative correction has transformed into humiliation designed to teach lesson about social boundaries that professional achievement cannot overcome when acceptance requires approval from people whose worth gets measured through bloodlines rather than service, connections rather than contributions, inheritance rather than innovation. When prejudice determines who deserves recognition regardless of merit that objective evaluation would acknowledge, but that subjective assessment often dismisses when bias influences judgment that fairness should govern, but that comfort often corrupts. The phone call that changes everything comes as Dr. Williams processes her exclusion with dignity that years of navigating institutional racism have taught her to maintain when dignity becomes strategy for survival rather than luxury that security provides. When grace under pressure demonstrates character that circumstances test but cannot break in people whose strength transcends external validation to serve purposes that prejudice might attack, but cannot ultimately destroy when mission matters more than recognition, healing more than status, service more than social position, when values guide behavior that obstacles might challenge, but cannot corrupt when integrity provides foundation that external pressures cannot shake. Keisha, I just saw the news about the museum removing your name, says the voice that transforms crisis into opportunity for demonstration of power that love provides when partnership serves justice rather than just personal advancement. When resources become tools for challenging systems rather than just accumulating comfort. When wealth serves righteousness rather than just purchasing position. When values determine how advantages get used to serve purposes that transcend individual benefit. To address systematic problems that collective action must solve if change is to become reality rather than just aspiration that rhetoric supports, but that practice often abandons. The caller is her husband, Michael, international business mogul whose empire spans continents, while remaining grounded in principles that success should serve justice rather than just accumulating advantage, whose wealth creates opportunities for challenging systems rather than just joining them, when position provides platform for demanding accountability that institutions resist, but that pressure can force when economic power serves social justice rather than just personal advancement through methods that effectiveness requires when change demands more than sentiment can provide through resources that influence can purchase, but that integrity must guide when power serves principles rather than just accumulating more power. His Rolls-Royce represents more than transportation. It symbolizes economic power that systematic exclusion cannot ignore when wealth speaks language that prejudice understands, even when morality fails to penetrate resistance that comfort zones maintain around assumptions that privilege protects through informal barriers that formal achievements cannot overcome until economic pressure forces recognition that fairness demands, but that tradition often refuses when change threatens arrangements that benefit some while disadvantaging others through patterns that investigation would expose, but that silence typically protects through networks that defend misconduct. The strategy they develop together demonstrates partnership that transcends individual advancement to address systematic problems through coordinated response that institutional discrimination cannot anticipate when accountability arrives through channels that preparation cannot protect against, when transparency penetrates secrecy that corruption requires for survival, when justice demands satisfaction that comfortable arrangements cannot provide through methods that scrutiny would expose, but That tradition prefers concealing when recognition would require changes that threaten established hierarchies, benefiting those whose position depends on maintaining systems that serve some while oppressing others. Michael's business relationships with museum board members create leverage that social position alone cannot provide when economic interests intersect with moral obligations in ways that prejudice cannot navigate. When choosing discrimination means choosing consequences that comfort zones typically avoid through plausible deniability that accountability eliminates when patterns become undeniable. When systematic behavior reveals intentions that individual actions might conceal, but that collective analysis exposes when investigation replaces comfortable assumptions with uncomfortable truth about institutional practices that reform must address through transparency that courage demands, but that tradition often resists. The Rolls-Royce Phantom's arrival outside the Metropolitan Museum creates moment of recognition as Manhattan's elite process site of ultimate luxury vehicle whose presence suggests wealth that cannot be dismissed, power that cannot be ignored, influence that cannot be excluded when economic authority speaks language that social prejudice understands, even when moral arguments fail to penetrate resistance that comfort zones maintain around assumptions about who deserves consideration when resources demand attention that principles alone cannot command through methods that effectiveness requires, when change needs more than sentiment can provide through pressure that results must create. Michael emerges from vehicle with bearing that 20 years of international business have refined into presence that authority recognizes even when prejudice would prefer dismissal. His movements carrying confidence that success provides when achievement transcends circumstances that might suggest inadequacy to eyes trained by bias to measure worth through characteristics unrelated to actual capability or contribution when competence demands recognition that systematic barriers cannot permanently prevent if persistence meets opportunity through channels that preparation creates, when readiness encounters moment that transformation requires through convergence of factors that individual effort alone cannot produce, but that collective action might achieve. The museum staff's reaction reveals institutional hierarchy that responds to wealth with efficiency that moral obligations alone cannot command. Their sudden attention demonstrating priorities that economic influence establishes when power speaks through channels that resistance cannot ignore despite personal prejudices that individual behavior might reflect, but that systematic pressure can overcome when consequences threaten comfort that opposition might lose if accountability demands choice. Between principle and convenience that self-interest typically resolves through accommodation that strategic thinking produces when alternatives become less attractive than cooperation. His request to speak with museum director creates chain reaction that transforms administrative crisis into institutional emergency as phone calls multiply throughout building while staff scramble to address situation that preparation cannot handle when accountability arrives through unexpected channels that standard protocols cannot manage, when transparency threatens arrangements that secrecy typically protects, when economic pressure intersects with moral obligation in ways that comfortable assumptions cannot navigate, when change demands responses that tradition hasn't anticipated through evolution that resistance cannot prevent, when circumstances force adaptation. The conversation that follows demonstrates power dynamics that wealth can rearrange when economic interest aligns with social justice to create pressure that prejudice cannot indefinitely resist through methods that institutional loyalty might protect temporarily, but that sustained attention can overcome when accountability demands satisfaction that comfortable arrangements cannot provide through evasion that investigation eliminates, when patterns become undeniable, when systematic behavior reveals intentions that individual actions might conceal, but that collective analysis exposes, when transparency replaces secrecy as operational standard. Museum Director Patricia Hamilton finds herself explaining administrative oversight to businessmen whose foundation provides funding that institutional budget requires for operation, whose international connections include board members of organizations that museum partnerships depend on for credibility, whose influence extends through networks that resistance cannot afford to alienate when economic consequences threaten sustainability, that confrontation might jeopardize through methods that calculation produces when self-interest demands accommodation, that strategic thinking provides when alternatives become unacceptable. What follows transforms individual crisis into institutional reformation as Dr. Williams receives not just reinstatement, but recognition that her contributions deserve when accountability forces acknowledgement that prejudice had prevented. When transparency eliminates comfortable distance that had enabled discrimination through administrative authority, that investigation exposes as systematic rather than accidental, when patterns reveal intentions that individual actions might disguise, but that collective behavior clearly demonstrates when analysis replaces assumptions with evidence that denial cannot overcome through comfortable lies that truth makes impossible to maintain. The gala itself becomes demonstration of transformation that accountability can achieve when economic pressure serves social justice to create change that moral arguments alone cannot force, through institutional resistance that comfort zones maintain around prejudices that tradition protects, but that consequences can eliminate when alternatives become unacceptable to organizations whose survival depends on adaptation, that strategic thinking requires when circumstances demand evolution, that preparation cannot anticipate, but that flexibility must enable when effectiveness requires responsiveness rather than just maintaining familiar arrangements. Dr. Williams's entrance creates a moment of recognition throughout gathering as New York's elite process side of woman whose exclusion had been attempted, but whose presence now commands attention that achievement deserves when competence demands acknowledgement regardless of social barriers that systematic discrimination might erect, but that persistence can overcome through methods that preparation creates when opportunity meets. Readiness in circumstances that individual effort alone cannot produce, but that partnership can achieve when resources serve righteousness rather than just accumulating advantage. Her speech about pediatric cardiac research transforms fundraising event into educational opportunity that reveals depth of knowledge that prejudice had attempted to silence, breadth of vision that narrow-mindedness cannot comprehend, commitment to healing that social position cannot measure when service transcends status, to demonstrate values that material wealth cannot purchase, but that character must provide when purpose guides behavior that obstacles might challenge but cannot corrupt, when integrity offers foundation that external pressures cannot shake through methods that testing reveals as unshakable, when principles prove stronger than circumstances. The donations that follow exceed previous records as attendees respond to presentation that combines medical expertise with humanitarian vision in ways that comfortable charity cannot match, when education replaces sentiment as motivation for giving that systematic change requires rather than just temporary relief that gestures provide without addressing root causes that sustained commitment must eliminate through approaches that effectiveness demands when results matter more than intention, impact more than image, transformation more than just maintaining arrangements that serve some while disadvantaging others. The museum's board meeting the following week results in policy changes that address systematic barriers that Dr. Williams's case had exposed when investigation reveals patterns that individual incidents might not constitute, but that collective analysis clearly demonstrates as institutional discrimination that reform must eliminate through transparency that accountability demands, oversight that prevents recurrence, standards that ensure fairness regardless of personal prejudices that individual behavior might reflect, but that systematic pressure can overcome when consequences enforce principles that policy establishes, but that culture must embrace. 6 months later, the Hart Foundation Gala has become model for inclusive fundraising that prioritizes mission over social hierarchy, effectiveness over exclusion, results over relationships, when purpose transcends prejudice to serve values that healing requires regardless of donor preferences, that money should never purchase in organizations dedicated to serving humanity rather than protecting comfort zones that tradition maintains, but that justice must challenge when systematic change demands institutional transformation that individual efforts alone cannot achieve, but that collective action can produce when preparation meets opportunity through channels that accountability creates. Dr. Williams's foundation receives unprecedented support as medical community recognizes contributions that social barriers had attempted to minimize. Her research attracting international collaboration that provincial thinking cannot prevent when excellence demands recognition regardless of packaging that might suggest inadequacy to eyes trained by bias, but that competence must overcome through results that effectiveness produces when dedication meets opportunity in circumstances that merit creates rather than inheritance provides, when achievement transcends background to serve purposes that healing requires regardless of social position or cultural assumptions about who deserves success, when lives benefit from innovations that brilliance creates. The Rolls-Royce that arrived in Storm has become symbol of partnership that serves justice rather than just personal advancement, wealth that challenges systems rather than just joining them, power that demands accountability rather than just accumulating influence, when values determine how advantages get used to address problems that systematic change must solve if institutions are to serve everyone rather than just those whose preferences align with administrative comfort, when democracy requires transparency that tradition might resist, but that pressure can force through methods that effectiveness demands, when results matter more than comfort. Miranda Thornton finds herself seeking new employment as museum implements accountability measures that prevent discrimination while ensuring competence rather than just connections determines who participates in institutional decisions that affect community served rather than just donors served, when organizations choose mission over money, purpose over privilege, justice over just maintaining arrangements that systematic reform must challenge through transparency that corruption fears, but that integrity demands, when public trust requires behavior that serves everyone rather than protecting private interests that influence should never purchase. Michael's business empire expands its philanthropic focus to address systematic barriers that exclude capable people from opportunities that merit should provide. His wealth becoming tool for creating access rather than just accumulating advantage, when partnership serves transformation that individual success cannot achieve alone, but that collective action can produce when resources serve righteousness rather than just personal advancement through methods that effectiveness requires, when change demands more than sentiment can provide through sustained commitment that obstacles cannot discourage, when purpose transcends profit to serve justice that systematic problems require. The woman they erased from guest list has become catalyst for transformation that extends far beyond single event into recognition that excellence exists everywhere, but gets acknowledged only when accountability forces institutions to choose between justice and comfort, between serving mission and serving prejudice, between effectiveness and exclusion, when pressure tests principles that policy might establish, but that practice must embrace if organizations are to fulfill obligations that public trust requires rather than just protecting arrangements that benefit some while disadvantaging others through methods that scrutiny exposes, but that silence typically protects, when comfort prefers ignorance to accountability that democracy demands from institutions whose legitimacy depends on serving everyone rather than just those whose approval feels comfortable, when prejudice meets principle in encounters that reveal whether organizations serve justice or just serve themselves, when power chooses between righteousness and convenience. If this story moved you, maybe it's time to examine the guest lists in your own life. The formal and informal ways we include or exclude people based on assumptions rather than merit. The subtle barriers we maintain that keep capable people from opportunities they deserve. The accountability we owe to ensure our institutions serve everyone rather than just those who look familiar or feel comfortable. If it is choose inclusion over exclusion, justice over comfort, merit over prejudice, when power creates opportunities to serve everyone rather than just serving ourselves.